After a few months, Five-Star Osiris managed to track down John, which they had been given task on to find. Even John tried to avoid being found by anyone, but now he was finally found by his enemy, Five-Star Osiris. As they found him, John activated his slip space generator on board his ship to avoid being captured by his enemy. As he was about to enter the slip space window, Firestar Cyrus fired up on his ship from behind, and somehow he managed to escape just barely. But just 3 seconds later, his ship left the slip space, and he was worried that his enemy had found him again. But according to his ship's radar, there were no ships at all nearby. And suddenly, the ship's alarm went off. According to the computer, that the damage that the ship five-star Cyrus had hit his ship had damaged his engines. And not only that, he saw there was a planet at distance, and he decided to land on the planet there to hide from his enemy and also try to figure out if he could repair the damage. But as he was approaching the planet, suddenly he had to realize it was too late. As he's approaching the planet, he lost control of the ship as he was trying to figure out a safe landing. But it was too late. He crash landed on the surface. A few hours later, John woke up feeling dizzy and he tried to figure out exactly what happened. But then he remembered. The fire star Osiris had found him and fired up his ship, and he crash landed on this unknown planet. He was worried that they had managed to find him again, but he couldn't activate his ship. Every system was offline, and not knowing if there was anybody was either in the orbit or on the planet. So he made a decision to at least look around. He grabbed his rifle, left his ship, and looked around, but no signs of his enemy anywhere. So at least they felt a bit safe, but he was still on high alert. He went back inside his ship to try to activate the systems, which he did, and he managed to activate the ship's computer to see how severe the damage were on the engines. And according to the computer, the engines were well beyond repair, meaning he was stuck on the planet and no way to get off. But then he came to realize, if this planet could have been a human colony, knowing that his people had settled down on many different planets across the galaxy, it could either be one of his people's colonies or it could have been a colony that belonged to one of the aliens that he had encountered throughout the years. So he decided to remain in the ship until there was anyone that could find him. So throughout the day and night, he was on high alert, holding his rifle next to him, hoping that no one would find him. And at least no one did. So for the next couple of days, he tried to figure out exactly if it was a way for him to leave the planet. But since his ship's engine was damaged beyond repair, there was nothing he could do. And not only that, his ship's ration was getting low, and he'd only tried to make half of it, try to save as much of that. But he realized, eventually his rations would run out, and if he didn't find any other source of food, he would starve. So he made a decision to look around in the forest to find any sort of food that he could find, but also try to figure out if there was any signs of any civilization on the planet. But as he was scouting the area, he found several bushes that had some berries, but he refused to even take any of them, without knowing if those berries were even poisonous or not, which was a risk he didn't want to take. So he either tried to look for any big animals that he could find to kill for food, or maybe find rivers or any lake for fish. And since his basic training as a survival in nature, But he managed to find at least a deer-like animal which he killed, and now he has some food for at least a few days. But after he realized this was something that he had to stay on. But as the day went, his bullets and his rifle ran out, and he didn't have any reserve animation on board on the ship. So he had to figure out a way to hunt for animals by any other means at all. He used some traps that he learned from his basic training and even had made a makeshift spear, even though that was only way for him to find some food. But he also found a small river not far from his ship, and he managed to have at least two sources of food, some animals and fish. Even he now felt safe from his enemy. But he never let his guard down because any day now his enemy could find him again. But as he put no signs of any signs of civilization on the planet, he thought maybe this was an inhabited planet now. So at least he felt safe. And even if he wanted to be found by someone, which it was a risk he didn't want to take, even though he probably would just activate his computer, his ship's emergency signal or a beacon. But he also figured out that was a bit too risky for that. But even he wanted, but he couldn't. The ship's emergency beacon and emergency system communications were both damaged beyond repair also. So he was truly stuck on the planet without anyone to help him. But one day, when he was exploring the centers in the forest a little bit further from his ship, he heard some sound, and he thought maybe it was a big animal. But as he was about to look to try to see if it was an animal, but it wasn't an animal. It was a person. In fact, a woman, a human woman. He figured out maybe that he was somehow had seen signs of any other people on the planet. So he tried to be silent as possible. This woman, a dark haired woman, was just looking around in the forest, doing some business like looking for some animals, food, and like it looks like she was picking some berries from a bush. But as John was just looking from a distance, observing her, trying to figure out exactly what to do next. If he should approach her or keep a distance, or maybe try to follow her to her place where she lives and figure out if there's any other big settlement on this planet. But he decided not to do that. For now, he decided to remain there, absorbing her and from a distance. Even though he was curious to know more about this woman, he didn't want to take the risk to approach her because he had no idea if she was a military or a civilian, and she and he didn't know exactly if she was someone he could trust. So he decided to wait to stay there until she left. After she had left, he went back to his ship, tried to figure out the next approach. He made another decision to remain silent, and for the next couple of days, he went back in the same area, and he did spot this woman a couple of times later on. But after a while, he decided to approach her, even if there was a risk that she could have been a military or a civilian. But as she saw that he was standing up, she saw that, and she saw him, and she saw that he was wearing his armor. He was still using his armor as some sort of protection against any other big animals. Since the armor gave him some valuable protection from any other animals if they would try to attack him. But as she saw it, she was scared. She raised something in her hand, and it somehow showed a light, a beam, from her hand. John was stunned. He has never seen any such technology before, and he thought maybe this was some sort of weapon, a new type of weapon that some of the human colonies had developed, which he has never even heard of. But she didn't do anything. She just stood there in some sort of defense pose. And John stood there. He didn't even approach or to say anything. He just stood there. The women were actually looked somehow more scared than anything. But as John had to make a decision either to approach her slowly or backward, or turn back to his ship and hoping that he could make a more peaceful approach. But since now she had found him, or at least seen him, and they were out the way from him to just to realize maybe it was best to try to approach her, maybe to talk to her or something. So he make it his made mind to approach her slowly, and when she did, but she didn't move. When he was only like a halfway a distance from her, he noticed that her position has changed a little bit. She was ready to attack if he was, but then he stopped and put up his arms and said, "Sorry, I'm not here to hurt you." But the woman looked at him, curious and stunned somehow. She was not understand a word for what he said. She didn't understand a word, but he then took off his helmet to show that he was in fact a human. Because this woman were in fact a Jedi survivor from Order 66. It has been 2 years since after the order came out, and she had found this planet that is survival. But when she saw this armor, she first believed that this maybe was a clone trooper with a new armor. But as he took off his helmet, saw it wasn't even a clone trooper. But she still didn't lower her guard because she didn't know if this was some sort of trick. Using another human as some sort of a trick to maybe figure out to find any Jedi survivors. But John, he once again tried to communicate with her, but it was some reason it was no reasonable to do so, or he could have somehow even talked to her. She didn't answer back though, but he didn't even take any step closer because he had no idea if how to respond if he did that. But he tried to communicate with her. But eventually, this young woman by the name Janira saw that he didn't meant any harm, but she didn't took her guard down. But she turned off her lightsaber and looked at him and slowly approached him, just slowly and stopped nearly halfway across to him. And then he could see that she was actually a young woman, probably like in her 20s or something. But he tried once again, trying to talk to her. But she had no idea for what language he was talking. And then she was talking in some language that he had never heard before. But realized maybe there was some sort of some language barrier. Janira thought maybe that he didn't belong to the Republic or this supposed this new empire. Maybe he was from maybe another colony or human world that hasn't even been hasn't even had talked the same language as her for a long time. But then she said, pointed herself, Janira, Janira. John did the same thing. John, John. Even now she felt a little bit safer knowing that he was not in another empire or even a clone trooper. But he still didn't felt she still didn't feel like she lowered her guard down completely. But she told him, or at least point, and to follow her. John first hesitated to even do so, because he didn't know if she would lead him to some sort of military's office or something like that, or military installation. But what other choice did he had? So he followed her, and he followed her to a small camp not far from there, which had a small ship and looks like this as like a small makeshift tent in the area. And he even saw this strange looking droid, a robot, like a humanoid robot. And the woman somehow called for this robot, which was a droid, a protocol droid. And she pointed at this man and asked if this droid could somehow communicate with this man, because she couldn't even understand his language. And she thought maybe her droid could perhaps maybe could communicate with him. After all, her droid could several million languages. So this droid walked up to this man named John, but it tried to communicate with him. Like the droid tried to talk in the galactic language, but no luck. But John tried to talk to this droid in his language. But after a few minutes, the droid told Janira he couldn't even understand any word that John said. But the droid said that it is possible, like he believed, that he could have been from a human world that hasn't even perhaps even no longer speak the galactic language. After all, some planets may have been insulated for some long time and developed their own language. So Janira tried to figure out a way for him to communicate with him. But then she pointed down to sit, which he did, and she called for the droid to hand over some food, and even John hesitated to even do so. But eventually, he agreed to eat something, even though there were a lot of difference that since they couldn't even communicate a single word between them. The droid told Janira that maybe there was a way for him to find out maybe where he lives. So she tried to communicate with John to try to figure out exactly if he could take her to his place. Even though first was hard to figure out exactly the communication, but eventually he figured out exactly what she meant for somehow, and he agreed. So the protocol droid followed with them also. After a while, they approached his ship, and when Janira saw his ship, she didn't even recognize the design of it. But after all, like the droid said, he could have kind of been from a planet that has been insulated, and also could have been had developed their own ship designs, which also would make sense. As John took her on board the ship, and she was amazed to see how it looked like. The droid was given access to a computer, and according to this, after a few minutes, he could still not even understand the language. But he did find the star maps on board in the ship's database, and hoping, tried to figure out if there was any way for her to somehow match any known database of her ship. So, but even though the droid actually had an access to a small portion of his memory to figure exactly to scan the star map on this John's ship to figure out if there was any match at all in his memory. But when Janira was told this star maps didn't even match any known star maps in the galaxy, she was stunned. But then she realized there are two known parts of the galaxy that hasn't even been completely mapped, which is the wild space and the unknown regions. She asked the droid if it is possible that it could have been from the unknown regions. The droid said it's a good possibility, knowing that the unknown regions are largely unmapped, which hasn't even been explored. And it's possible they could some contain some human colonies, and that's which makes a lot of sense that the galactic language wasn't even spoken by his people. But after a while, though, Janira somehow managed to communicate with John, telling that she had to leave. And she did. But the next day, she went back to him without the droid. And she tried to figure out exactly a way to communicate. But since he couldn't even read her language or understand the words, there was still a very big language barrier. But after a while, though, like a few days, somehow he managed to get some of the basic understanding of her language. So now they had a way to communicate. And John explained that he was not from this place of something she called unknown regions. And when he asked her about this laser sword, what is it called? It's like maybe that he wasn't from the unknown regions, that since people who lived in the unknown regions perhaps never had encountered a Jedi, or maybe even heard about lightsabers. So she explained what the lightsaber are, and who the Jedi are and what has been happening. And she asks the same thing about him, where he's from, or and it turns out that from what her understanding, he's from a different planet in an empire, or at least in some sort of galactic nation of humans. But in her understanding that either the Galactic Republic, which she served earlier, didn't exist. The Empire? No, not either. And the Jedi Order? They didn't even heard of. And the Force? They didn't even exist where he came from. To her, that sense sounds very strange, because any species in her galaxy could have possessed the Force. But then the protocol droid made some sort of a theory. What if somehow he had traveled from a distant galaxy to hers? Or maybe from an ultimate dimension? Or from an ultimate universe? Those theories made her realize maybe those were probably crazy. There's no way that he could be from another galaxy, or a different ultimate dimension or ultimate reality. But after realized, it was a lot of things that those things that he had told her, that he has never heard of the Force, the Jedi, or even heard of lightsabers until she explained it. It wouldn't make sense. So she believed maybe it was the best possibility that he had came from an ultimate universe from a different galaxy. But then they realized, how is it possible he had ended up from his dimension or his universe and he from his galaxy to hers? Then he realized, slip space generator. When he did 5-star Cyrus fire up on his ship when he tried to escape, the damage on that could have been had made a rift between his ultimate universe to hers, and somehow must have somehow allowed his ship to travel between their dimension, their universes, and from his galaxy to hers. Even this, even though that makes a lot of no sense in her mind, but there is the only explanation that they both could accept. So he asked her more about this Jedi, and she told him all about it, what she knows. And she was, in fact, a Jedi Knight who had survived. But after a few days, their friendship actually started getting more stronger. And from now, John actually could go to her camp at any time that he wanted, so that he could have some company with her. Over time, John and Janira started to like each other a bit more. He even asked her more about her galaxy, and she taught him all about the past wars, like the Clone Wars, about the Galactic Republic, about the Jedi history, and something like that. And the same thing in return. He was teaching her about his life, in the military service, about the battles he had been in the past, and what type of aliens that he encountered, and it's like, and how his homework was like. She was actually eager to know more about it. And as their friendship was developing to a much stronger bond, he even gave her this basic military training if something were to happen, and if she didn't have access to her lightsaber, and that she needed somehow self-defense combat training and hand-to-hand combat training if something would happen. And she appreciated that. And their friendship from all that point had become so strong that they started hanging out more and more often at his or her camp. As the time was passing, John and Janira was actually eager to know more about each other, but at the same time, John wanted to see more of her galaxy. And since his ship was damaged beyond repair, and she had a functional working ship, but knowing the status of the galaxy, that still there could be some Jedi's out there being hunted down, and she knows it was a big risk. If she went out in the galaxy, she could be found and even be executed as a traitor to the Empire. or at least the Galactic Republic, which now is Empire. John understood that, and he said, if something would happen, I will try to defend you for any reason I can. But even if she appreciated, there was still a lot of questions that it was even worth to leave the galaxy or this planet. But after 2 years of being living together on the planet, though, Janira decided maybe it wasn't worth to leave. So, but before they left, though, they both agreed to destroy John's ship because if someone would find the remains of his ship, would figure out something else being there. So they used her ship's weapons to destroy his, and he was actually agreed to move on from that part of his history. So after they left the planet, though, both Janira and John started traveling around, and they tried to avoid from any major planets or any other things. But knowing that the Empire by this point probably controlled all the whole galaxy. But Janira, she had now dressed as like a civilian. She was trying to hide her Jedi heritage. John, he was actually eager to know more about the galaxy now that they've been traveling around from world to world, from planet to planet, encountered different species on his travels. He was actually curious and even eager to know more. But as they had traveled together, John started having some feelings for Janira. But he knew that the Jedi's were not allowed to have any sort of attachment to anyone, like even being in a relationship with other people. So he decided not to even telling her that. But what he didn't know, even though that Janira had followed the Jedi code all her life, she had also started feeling attracted towards John. But she was she was split in her belief to follow the Jedi code strictly or at least to open up herself to be allowed her feelings to be opened and answered towards John. She had no idea what to do. She really cared about him. She really loved him. But there were still a lot of questions like if she really wanted to open up and even to follow the Jedi Code directly, strictly, as she had been taught over the years, or just or even still follow the code but still be in a relationship with someone like John. But eventually, Janira decided she was going to tell John about her feelings, but still following the Jedi Code strictly, despite being not following that part. So she told him. He wasn't surprised because he mentioned the same thing to her, and she was equally surprised at. And both agreed to give it a try to be together. And they also had one other mission on their travels. Is to try to figure out if there were any other Jedi survivors out there. Even try to maybe connect some of them. But knowing there were like before the Clone Wars like 10,000 Jedi Knights right across the galaxy. But now there was only like a handful of survivors. Janira believed that even know that some of the survivors may have hidden somewhere so well deep in the galaxy, or some of may have even given up as being as a Jedi way to live something else in order to survive. And after being traveling around for maybe 6 months after they left the planet, they hadn't even encountered any other survivors, and they didn't want to ask around for any Jedi survivors because that could have been a draw attention towards Imperial forces, which they didn't want to risk though. But they knew there were perhaps some Jedi temples or planets or outposts that may contain survivors, so they went to some of the worlds that Janira knew about. But as they approached at least maybe a few of them, all of those planets, at least those few that they went to, those outposts, temples, had been all destroyed. There was nothing left. No survivors, nothing. So Janira started believing maybe there weren't any other survivors out there in the galaxy. But John assured her there must be some survivors if she managed to survive on the planet for 4 years without it being found out by the Empire. So there must have been others. That encouraged her to even try to increase her search, even she didn't want to be approached by any Imperial forces. But they managed to find at least one lead of one of the survivors of the Order. Obi-Wan Kenobi was still alive, but they didn't want to go to see him because they didn't want to draw attention towards him or any other potential survivors out there. But they at least heard there were at least a number of survivors, but they decided not to approach anyone because they didn't want to draw attention to themselves or to other survivors which is out there in the galaxy. John and Janira continued their travels throughout the galaxy and eventually even encountered a few other Jedi survivors, but they kept their location a secret for themselves because they didn't want to have them to be found by the Galactic Empire. But one day, when they were exploring a planet for some more supplies, John ended up getting hurt by when an animal attacked him. And since the planet didn't have any medical training or facilities anywhere, so Janira had only one other option. She decided to bring him to another planet where he could get some treatment. And she managed to find a small outpost colony in the vicinity and managed to get him to treatment. And seeing him in the bacta tank while recovering, she was so she was so close to being afraid of losing her only boyfriend, lover at this point. But she was really happy that he pulled through. And John was actually very grateful that Janira took him to the nearest planet where he gets on the treatment. And he told her that he would done the same thing to her, in which she agreed. But their relationship only grows stronger for that point, though. I mean, John, he really loved Janira, even though he wasn't a Jedi Knight himself, but he was still a skilled warrior, fighter, and she was even skilled in her own training, and especially when the Force, when she can jump up in the air higher than even he can. Even though he felt a bit jealous that she had some mystical power that he didn't possess. But nevertheless, he was still happy and proud to be with someone like her. Even though they travel across the galaxy together, meeting new people, new planets all the time, they even went to some planets that she had been on before during her training as a Padawan and as when she became a Jedi Knight. But she knows there are always a big risk going to planets that has any sign of Jedi temples, outposts that still remained. But they managed to find at least a few temples, outposts that hasn't even been found by the Empire. There they sometimes spent some time where she could continue her training, and they even used some of the outposts or temples as some sort of temporary home. But they didn't want to stay in one place too long because who knows that if they would be found by the Empire. Janira knows that she would be either being interrogated, executed but as a traitor, or being forced to serve the Empire as a dark side user. And John, they had no idea what his treatment would be. Either a lifetime imprisonment or even also worse, execution. Because if they found out he had been hiding a Jedi survivor among himself, he would more likely be executed. But so they didn't stay at one place too long. But there are a few places that they could stay for longer. When they found a small planet that didn't have any settlements or no imperial presence on it, they decided to stay there for a little bit longer period of time. And eventually, they found a small planet they could call home. It was a small forest planet though, and that planet was nowhere any near of any imperial wars, worlds, or any military presence, anything. There were no other settlements on the planet at all. So Janira and John decided to make that their first official home. And eventually, over time, Janira heard the news. about something that she has ever heard, had ever hoped to be true. Because ever since things had settled down on their planet, 16 years had passed. And one day, over news, John and Janira heard that the Empire had fallen. The Emperor was dead. Darth Vader, his enforcer, was dead. At first, Janira didn't even believe any of those news because she first believed that this was some sort of imperial propaganda in order to trick out any other survivors who approach, came out from the hiding, and then easily would be found and being executed. So they didn't listen to this news. They remained on their planet for next a few years, in fact. And even though it wasn't until like 8 years later when Janira and John heard the news about something else. Since they had heard of this new republic had been replaced by the Empire, and now, only several years later, like 8 years later, when they found out Luke Skywalker, a Jedi Knight, had started his own Jedi Order, and he has announced this and even encouraged any other survivors, Padawans, younglings, masters, knights, anyone who has been in hiding for all those years, are always welcome back to the new Jedi Order with open arms. John was actually eager to know more about this, and he even encouraged Janira to approach this Jedi Temple or Luke Skywalker. But eventually, she was actually convinced by John to at least go there to maybe see if this actually are true news. When she and John arrived to Yavin 4, it was actually true. John was surprised to see that Luke Skywalker was in fact a Jedi Knight. And he thought that maybe they didn't want to encounter any others though. Even though John and Janira had encountered a few other survivors on their travels. But they had both promised not to tell anyone. Even though that Luke is a knight, a Jedi, they probably could tell him, but they both agreed to wait for that at least. Janira was actually welcomed to the Jedi Temple on Yavin 4 by Luke, offered her a position as a teacher at his new academy to train a new generation of Jedi. Even though that Janira was hesitant, she had even trained any Jedi or even had been doing much Jedi training for herself for the past few years. She had almost given up her to be as a Jedi, but now been offered to be as a teacher. Not only that, she had been even offered to take her own apprentice, or even apprentices. John, he actually told Janira she can do it, but then she asked about him. What will he do? Will he even stay or go back home? John said he would stay on Yavin 4 with her, and Luke had no one against that. He was not against that John stayed on behind because who knows? His training experience could even help the new Jedi Knights or Padawans to be how to train not only as a military ways. Because when John offered his service to train the Padawans, Knights, and Masters in in a military training like like hand-to-hand combat, self-defense training, just in case if there's something important, if then had access to a weapon or a lightsaber. Luke actually thought that could have been a good idea. So John became as like a military trainer as officer at this new temple. So over time, John and Janira actually got married also on Gavin 4 only about like 2 years later. But eventually, they decided maybe there was something else they wanted to do. But only like 2 years later, Janira and John found out they were expecting a baby soon. Both were really excited. Janira almost. She had never even expected that she was going to be a parent. But as the future of the Jedi Order to continue, any Jedi survivors who had any children of their own could increase the number of any potential Jedi's in the future. But there is always a risk that their child may not be even force sensitive. But When Janira and John had their own daughter, after only a few months later, they found out she was force sensitive, a strong one, in fact. So when John and Janira started was about 10, she started to be training as a Jedi Knight under teaching of one of masters of Luke Skywalker. And eventually, John and Janira even had a son later when their daughter was about 5. And even their son was also force sensitive. And he also became a great Jedi Knight along with his older sister. But eventually, afterward, when they had their son, John and Janira decided maybe it was time for them to settle down on different place where they didn't have to be worried much. Because after now the new Jedi Order had been growing in numbers. Janira had been trained a number of Jedi Knights and Padawans over a few years, and having her own family of her own. Her daughter and her son now was full trained Jedi Knight, serving the new Jedi Knight, the Jedi Order, under teaching of Luke Skywalker. Janira told Luke that she had decided to retire as from the temple or from the order, and he accepted it. So both John and Janira went to a small planet, or at least a small colony, where they remained there together. Even all this, Janira was actually happy that she would ran into John all those years ago. If she didn't have it, she may not even had found her true love, or may not have even left that particular planet, and never had encountered the new Jedi Order and served them. And John, though, he was actually happy that this supposed minor accident happened, so that he somehow ended up this galaxy and end up meeting his true love. Even though her originally didn't expect him to fall in love with someone at all. He just wanted to follow orders, serve the military, protect the humanity from any sort of threat. But knowing that he was being threatened, or at least being had been found out that someone is actually his own government had sent orders to find him, to capture him, and his own government had turned against him. So he chose to run. And that's the way when he later ended up meeting Janira in an other dimension or galaxy of all places. But he was happy to have met Janira and found her not only by finding her, but finding his true self. Not longer to be a military officer or a fighter in a war, but being volunteer to be as a training officer to help others to be learning about self-defense like that. But living with Janira on the new home was the best thing that ever happened, even included with having a family with her. And this is how John 117 and Janira, for the true love, got a big family together. The end.